Years ago this September, a Labor Day party at a hotel in San Francisco led to the death of a young woman and to the arrest of one of Hollywood's biggest stars on a charge of murder. It's always difficult, in the case of murder, to establish the exact facts, and it's especially difficult where the person involved is a very influential or very famous or very important one. This is my consideration of what happened at that party on the 5th of September, 1921.
In early September 1921, three friends from the motion picture industry in Hollywood motored up the coast to San Francisco. They were in high spirits because a weekend Labor Day party had been arranged, and although the strictures of prohibition were intended to curb such activities as drinking alcohol, it was more honoured in the breach than in its observance. The three friends were stars in the movie industry, and the biggest of these, figuratively and literally, was the man at the wheel of the car, Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle himself. From his instantly recognizable outsized physique, weighing 266 pounds, and slapstick comedic talent, he had carved himself a huge slice of the pie, and was second only to Charlie Chaplin in terms of earnings. In fact, he had just signed a contract for 3 years with Paramount Pictures for $1 million a year. That's nearly $20 million a year in 2021 terms. He was accompanied on this trip by his friends Fred Fishback and Lowell Sherman, both successful actor-directors. They had hired a suite of 3 rooms at the St. Francis Hotel in San Francisco for the Labor Day party. Room 1219 was Arbuckle's room. Another was actor Lowell Sherman's, and the third room was to be used for the party. About 25 people attended, and things started well enough. A Victrola gramophone played the crackling acoustic recordings of the jazz age. People danced. Smoke hung thick and blue in the air, and the sound of laughter was liberal amongst them. Everyone drank too much, and of course there was no shortage of young starlets, anxious to get a part in movies or advance their careers, all attractive, eager, and willing. Amongst the slew of girls attending the extended party was one who stood out from the rest, a 30-year-old woman. She claimed to be 26, called Virginia Rappe. She arrived at around 10:30 a.m. with a friend, Bambina Maud Delmont. Rappe was a woman who caught the eye. Of considerable beauty, she had been born out of wedlock to Mabel Rappe in 1891 and raised by her grandmother in Chicago, her mother having died when Virginia was young. She was a bright, ambitious girl, and blessed with extraordinary good looks and figure. She added an E to the end of her name to lend it a certain cachet and became a model. A successful one, too. Given her looks and figure, how could she not be? She was soon earning around $4,000 a year, about $120,000 in 2021. Her form and face graced the covers of magazines coast to coast and beyond. She modelled in Paris and London. In 1915, she became engaged to a fashion designer called Robert Moskowitz, but he died in a streetcar accident, and thereafter she pursued her own career as a dress designer. During the war, she was known for her striking designs, often white and with a peace theme. It was, perhaps, inevitable such a woman would eventually gravitate to the new moving picture industry, and by 1920 she had carved out a successful career for herself as an actress, having recently starred in a short film. She had acted with Rudolph Valentino also, and was a friend of Charlie Chaplin's wife Mildred. Naturally, she had been voted the best-dressed girl in pictures, too. She was. By 1917, she was engaged to the actor and director Henry Lehrman. a major player in Hollywood who had directed a number of Chaplin and Arbuckle movies, and he may have introduced her to Arbuckle. She had small parts in Arbuckle movies from 1917 on and attracted his attention. Arbuckle loved attractive women. He sent her gifts, including, it was reported, a gold watch inscribed to her. He was much taken with her. At the time of the fateful party, Lehrman and Rappe had quarrelled, and he had gone to New York. Rappe was rather anxious about this breach with her fiancé, but she was a woman on the up and up. If not quite Hollywood royalty yet, she was a woman with a future. Well, perhaps she was. The exact facts are, as ever in such cases, in dispute, but it is clear that early in the afternoon on the 5th of September 1921, Roscoe Arbuckle, wearing pyjamas, was in his bedroom with Virginia Rappe, and the door was locked. At some point afterwards, Virginia Rappe's friend, Maud Delmont, heard a scream, became concerned, and went and knocked on the door. Receiving no reply, she tried the handle, and finding it was locked, she began to kick it and shout to be let in. Unable to get an answer, and Virginia Rappe having been closeted in the room alone with Arbuckle for about 30 minutes, she sent for the hotel assistant manager, Harry Boyle. At length Arbuckle appeared at the door in his pyjamas and wearing Virginia Rappe's green-banded white Panama hat set on his head at a rakish angle. On the bed behind him lay a semi-naked Virginia Rappe, moaning in some distress. The guests rushed in, and thinking she was drunk, Rappe was stripped naked and placed in a tub of cold water, before being removed to her own room by Arbuckle and Fred Fishback. Her friend Maud Delmont called a doctor to attend to her. Dr. Olaf Carbo, followed by Dr. Arthur Beardsley, saw the ill woman, and were both told by Maud Delmont that Virginia had been raped by Arbuckle. But neither of them seems to have taken Delmont's claims of rape seriously, or seen any sign of it, and both thought she was merely drunk. Increasingly frustrated, Delmont called a third doctor, Dr. Melville Rumwell, and she told him that a drunk Arbuckle had dragged Virginia into his bedroom, sexually assaulted her, and that this was responsible for her present condition. Virginia Rappe deteriorated in the next 48 hours. She was admitted to hospital on the 7th of September, and here she died 2 days later, on the 9th of September, 1921. Maud Delmont decided to go to the police. She informed them that Virginia Rappe had told her that Arbuckle had raped her. A police investigation began. These are the facts upon which the case was predicated. Beyond this, there is a great deal of confusion and obfuscation, much of it by design, and little agreement. Every fact claimed on one side has its equal and opposite counterfact on the other. Roscoe Conkling Arbuckle was born on March the 24th, 1887, in Smith Center, Kansas, one of 9 children. When he was just 2 years old, his family moved to Santa Ana, California, and he was on stage from the age of 8. His mother died when he was 11, and he graduated to singing. Apparently he had a good voice, and then to a vaudeville career as a comedian. In 1908 he married actress Minta Durfee, and the following year he made some short movies, initially with the Selig Polyscope Company, and then, following a brief stint with Universal Studios, he settled with Paramount. The new silent moving pictures were ideal for his kind of visual humour. He had a great talent for making people laugh, and in spite of his size, a certain grace in his movements. The camera liked him, and he was soon commanding huge salaries as Fatty Arbuckle. With success came the perks of money and power, and he learned how to live well, and was known for it. He bought a Pierce Arrow motor car for $8,000 in 1919 and spent a further $25,000, that's about $400,000 today, on customizing it to include a concealed bar, ideal for transporting liquor in those Prohibition years. He also bought Theda Barra's old house in West Adams Boulevard for $250,000, about $4 million today, and spent a further fortune in refurbishing it to his taste. He dressed flamboyantly in loud checkered suits, liked parties, food and alcohol, and wherever he went, women were never in short supply. An autopsy on the body of Virginia Rappe revealed that she had died from a ruptured bladder, and that this had been caused as a result of great pressure being applied to her abdomen. The bladder was inflamed too, and acute peritonitis was present, but no pathological change was found to have been present prior to its being ruptured, which implied that the rupture had initiated her other conditions. There was also extensive bruising to her thighs and arms noted. Police suspicions focused immediately on Arbuckle. Maud Delmont, who attended the party with Virginia Rappe, and who called the hotel manager and doctors and had her friend admitted to hospital, claimed Virginia had told her that "Roscoe did this to me." Delmont was not the most reliable witness, had a distinctly checkered background, but was nevertheless quite insistent regarding her story. Another girl at the party, Alice Blake, a chorus girl, confirmed her story. She told police that Virginia had told her the following day, "Roscoe hurt me." And a starlet called Zay Prevost also told authorities that Virginia Rappe had said, "I am dying. He did it." Police took statements from those present at the party, examined the hotel suite, and on the 11th of September, Arbuckle was arrested and charged with the murder of Virginia Rappe. An inquest into Virginia's death was held, at which a nurse at the Wakefield Sanatorium, where Virginia had been taken, told the coroner, Thomas Leland, that Virginia Rappe had told her that improper relations occurred with Arbuckle, but she did not indicate whether or not these had been consensual. She said Virginia had been particularly anxious that her fiancé, Henry Lehrman, should not find out about this. Al Semnecker, a close friend of Arbuckle's, and also Virginia's manager, told the inquest that Virginia had told him the following day Roscoe had hurt her. Delmont gave evidence that Arbuckle had pulled Virginia Rappe into his bedroom, saying, "I've waited for you for 5 years, and now I've got you." She also said he then closed the door. After about 30 minutes, Delmont said she called Harry Boyle, the hotel assistant manager, and he arrived and called to Arbuckle, who then opened the door. He was dressed in his pyjamas and wearing Virginia Rappe's Panama hat at a comical angle. It was established at inquest that everyone had rushed in to see what was happening. Virginia was lying semi-naked on the bed, and obviously distressed. She was tearing at her clothes and screaming in pain, according to witnesses. Arbuckle had told her to "shut up, or I'll throw you out of the window." The evidence was mounting, but it was all disputed, especially the results of the autopsy, and many of the guests claimed not to remember what had occurred. To clarify matters, the coroner's physician, Dr. Shelby Strange, conducted a second autopsy, and he confirmed the dead woman's injuries were caused by great external force being applied to her abdomen. He also noted bruising to her right upper arm, which appeared to have been caused by the deep impression of fingers. Matthew Brady, the district attorney, concluded that Arbuckle had indeed raped Rappe, as Delmont had claimed, and that as she and Alice Blake, Al Semnecker, Vera Cumberland, and the woman called Zay Prevost had further claimed, Roscoe had hurt her. It therefore seemed conclusive that Arbuckle's great weight had been responsible for her injuries. But Arbuckle told a very different story to that of Delmont and others. In fact, he told several different stories before settling on one. Initially, he said he had a few drinks with Rappe in his room. She complained she could not breathe and tore off all her clothes. He said others were in the room at the time, and they had thought she was drunk and put her in the bath. Then 2 women at the party took her to her own room. But Arbuckle later adapted his story to admit he had been locked in his room alone with Rappe, but only for a short time, he said, and that he had found her there vomiting when he went into the room. Matthew Brady and his team were sceptical of this. But Brady had a problem. His chief witness, Maud Delmont, was hardly a woman whose character could stand the scrutiny of a skilled defence lawyer, nor could those of any of his other witnesses. These were not people of outstanding probity, and whatever it was claimed Virginia Rappe had told various people, it was hearsay. The only people who knew what had happened in the locked room of 1219 on the 5th of September were Roscoe Arbuckle and Virginia Rappe, and one of these was dead. But the accounts heard were suggestive, and the coroner's jury gave its verdict as manslaughter against Arbuckle. In spite of this, Brady decided to press ahead and charge Arbuckle with murder. Under California's Civil Code, it was provided that if life was taken during the commission of an offence, it should be regarded as murder. Therefore, even if Virginia Rappe's death was not intended, the fact that it was caused as a result of the commission of another offence, i.e. rape, would make it murder. At preliminary hearings at the police court, a judge rejoicing in the name of Sylvain Lazarus decided the charge against Arbuckle should be one of manslaughter. District Attorney Brady had little choice but to accept that with the coroner's jury and police court determining there was not sufficient evidence to go after a murder charge, he would be forced to proceed with the lesser one. Arbuckle was therefore bailed once the charge was reduced to one of manslaughter. He had reason to be satisfied. The offence of manslaughter carried a maximum sentence of only 10 years, compared to that of murder, for which the penalty was death. The arrest for murder and subsequent charges for manslaughter of one of the greatest stars of the movies naturally created world headlines, and the newspaper industry, which feeds off sensation, had some of the most lurid headlines they could possibly have dreamed of. William Randolph Hearst, the press mogul whose newspapers dominated America at that time, according to Buster Keaton, later said that the Arbuckle affair had sold more newspapers than any other event since the sinking of the Lusitania by a German U-boat in 1915. There is no doubt it shocked America, and it shocked the world's reading public too, because the movie phenomenon had reached into the homes and lives of people throughout the developed world. There was a great deal of public anger directed at Arbuckle as the circumstances became known, and much of this was innuendo and lurid speculation, but caused great damage. Meanwhile, Brady was becoming increasingly concerned at what he believed to be efforts made by Arbuckle's friends and others working for the defence to intimidate or buy off witnesses, and he decided to request that Betty Campbell and Alice Blake be placed under 24-hour police protection. The trial of Roscoe Arbuckle began on the 14th of November 1921 before Judge Harold Louderback. Arbuckle was defended by Gavin McNabb, a highly successful lawyer, with Matthew Brady, DA, and Leo Friedman, his deputy, appearing for the state. Arbuckle and his advisers took a two-handed approach to his defence. One was to attack the state witnesses, people like Delmont, who had initiated the police complaint, and here there was, naturally, much to attack. These were people whose lives were shocking to ordinary American folk, people whose mode of living and habits were far removed from their own. The other approach was to supply witnesses who were willing to give a different version of events, one more favourable to Arbuckle. The prosecution case was that Arbuckle had attended a party whose principal purpose was for the indulgence of the sexual appetites of the star and his friends. He had lusted after Virginia Rappe, may even have lured her there with promises of career advancement. Whatever the case, he had taken her to his room that afternoon, where he had locked the door and raped her. As a result of that rape, and his considerable weight and bulk, he had caused her injuries which had resulted in her death 4 days later. The defence was simply that there was no evidence to prove that this is what had occurred, and to show that Miss Rappe had suffered from a bladder condition which had precipitated her illness and led to her death. Arbuckle and others had done what they could for Rappe, claimed the defence, but owing to no fault of his, she had died of injuries which had nothing to do with him. The prosecution soon ran into trouble. The defence had dug deep for dirt on Maud Delmont and found something. She was bigamously married. It was a blow for the prosecution, as it seriously tarnished her character as a witness. She could not be called. She had effectively been neutralised as a witness. But it was not plain sailing for Arbuckle's team either. There was much evidence heard of an oblique kind, which damaged Arbuckle. Betty Campbell, a model, testified she had spent most of the Labour Day party fighting off the unwanted advances of his friend Lowell Sherman. Apparently Sherman had called her into his bedroom, and when she went, had slammed the door behind her and locked it. Outside, she could hear everyone laughing about this. She ran into the bathroom and locked the door behind her. He continued to try to gain access to her, but at length he gave up, and she managed to escape. But as she did so, Arbuckle's other friend, Freddie Fishback, tried to push her back into the room again. She said, "I shut the door on him and later got out to safety." Such revelations of the predatory, rapacious nature of Arbuckle and his two friends were profoundly shocking, and the press reported them with barely concealed glee. The medical evidence was itself equivocal. Dr. William Ophuls, who performed the initial autopsy, found no signs of violence, nor of illness to Miss Rappe. She was a healthy young woman, he said. His report vindicated both defence and prosecution. Dr. Beardsley, too, testified that the ruptured bladder had been caused by external force, but he said there was no sign of rape. Other witnesses were more helpful to the prosecution case. A nurse, referring to bruises and injuries Rappe had received, thought they gave the appearance of her having been raped, and Zay Prevost, whose real name was Sadie Rice, said she heard Rappe say Roscoe had hurt her. Dr. Edward Heinrich, a fingerprint expert, discovered Virginia Rappe's fingerprints on the door, over which Arbuckle's were overlaid in a manner that suggested his hand had been placed over hers. He believed this indicated that she had attempted to escape Arbuckle, but had been prevented from doing so. The defence was able to mitigate or lessen the effect of these, and introduce elements of uncertainty, even claiming that Rappe's heavy jewellery accounted for the bruising on her body. But there was something shocking, something that was to become memorable and infamous in the case, yet to come. Arbuckle's friend and Virginia's manager, Al Semneker, called to the witness stand, with obvious reluctance and a great deal of prevarication, agreed that he had been present at the party, and was present at a discussion involving Arbuckle and his friends the following day, at which they had discussed the events of the party. He constantly claimed he could not remember events, but at length he made a slip. Brady asked him, "Did Arbuckle say anything at the time about a piece of ice?" It was out of the blue, and Semneker was clearly flustered. He said at last, "He did." "What did he say?" "He told us he had placed a piece of ice on Miss Rappe." "On?" queried Brady. Semneker, following a long pause, said, "No." "Well, exactly what did Arbuckle say?" demanded Brady. "I don't want to use his words," said the unhappy Semneker. "I insist they are important," continued the DA. Still Semneker would not say. "Well, whisper them to the court reporter," Brady suggested. Semneker did, and these were written down and conveyed to counsel. Arbuckle sat stone-faced, his wife, Minta Durfee, rigid by his side, who was separated from him, but who consistently played the part of loving wife throughout the proceedings, turned away from him. She looked distressed. Pressed by counsel, Semneker said when Arbuckle recounted this anecdote concerning the ice to the mail company on that occasion, all those present laughed. Further pressed, he could not recall who had laughed, or whether he himself had laughed, and could not say who did. It was a general thing, he said. There is little doubt that the story of the ice, which in popular urban mythology would become a Coca-Cola bottle or champagne bottle, is untrue. But it seems probable that Arbuckle did tell the anecdote concerning the ice to the mail company that day, as a distasteful joke. How he must have regretted it. Semneca's testimony, extremely damaging to Arbuckle, was all the more potent because it was drawn from him most unwillingly, and the response of Arbuckle's defence was to blacken Semneca's name and character, and to claim he was in conspiracy with Delmont and others. In truth, Semneca had divided loyalties towards his deceased client and his friend Arbuckle. Arbuckle took the stand on the 28th of November. He stated he had known Virginia Rappe for 5 or 6 years, and said, "When I walked into 1219, I closed the door and locked it, and I went to the bathroom, where I found Miss Rappe on the floor in front of the toilet. She'd been vomiting." He said he had carried her to the bed and laid her on it. He said he went to get help, and when he returned, he found Miss Rappe tearing off her clothes. Mrs. Delmont rubbed ice on her stomach, he claimed, and they put her in a tub of cold water because she was hysterical. Then he and Fred Fishback carried her to her own room. He stuck to this story, in which he was clearly well drilled, and kept his nerve impressively in the face of aggressive and provocative cross-examination by Assistant D.A. Friedman. Lowell Sherman was less effective. He took the witness stand and tried to make light of the party. It was, he said, just a few old friends chatting. Brady was quick upon him like a fox. "A few old friends?" he queried. "What did you think when Virginia Rappe was carried out screaming?" "I thought she was drunk," he replied. He admitted he had been present when she had all of her remaining clothes removed from her, and Brady inquired, "Is it customary for men at a party to take a girl's clothes off, and for other men to watch, even if she's drunk? Wouldn't you say that that is more than just a couple of good friends chatting?" At the very least, Arbuckle and his friends looked like callous voyeurs. The jury, after long and arduous deliberation, which lasted 44 hours, were deadlocked. A unanimous decision was required, and they could reach only a 10-2 majority for not guilty. A mistrial was therefore called. There would be a fresh trial. Nevertheless, Arbuckle's attorneys issued a statement claiming that had it not been for a single woman juror, Mrs. Helen Hubbard, who had been intransigent and unreasonable, he would have been acquitted and exonerated. It was a falsehood. There was another juror who had held out in the final 22nd ballot of the jurors and voted Arbuckle guilty. It also emerged that other jurors thought Arbuckle guilty too, but that they thought the evidence was insufficient to warrant a conviction. Helen Hubbard was nevertheless vilified, and numerous attacks were made on her by Arbuckle's attorneys and by those employed to shore up the public relations aspect of the trial for him. The case was heard again on the 11th of January 1922. For trial number 2, the prosecution and defence and their teams were unchanged. Judge Louderback again oversaw proceedings, but now the defence placed increased emphasis on the dissolute life and character of Virginia Rappe, and greater claims still were made concerning her medical history. The defence got off to a flying start. A string of witnesses attested to Virginia Rappe having suffered severe abdominal pain after drinking alcohol on previous occasions, and this, they said, was frequently accompanied by her tearing her clothes off. It seemed suggestive, but D.A. Matthew Brady, sensing foul play, discovered that one of the witnesses making such claims, Minnie Neighbours, had lied. Virginia Rappe had never been at her hotel, and as a result, Minnie Neighbours was charged with perjury. Another witness was also found to be lying, and a third was found to be a friend of Arbuckle's. In addition, 4 people were discovered to have offered their services of giving false evidence to the defence counsel for money. The defence did not deny these, but said they had not accepted the offers. The prosecution countered these claims by calling old friends of Virginia's to testify that she had never suffered any illnesses of the bladder, did not have alcohol sensitivity, nor did she exhibit the conduct the defence attributed to her of tearing off her clothes after drinking. In addition, the prosecution pointed out that no medical history of Virginia's alluded to bladder infections, and one feminine ailment she had suffered 8 years prior to her death was a common one and had no bearing on the matter. And in any case, 3 doctors appointed by the court to examine Virginia's organs concluded that there was no constitutional weakness or pre-existing complaint, whatever other random doctors recruited for such a purpose could be persuaded to claim. Additional evidence for the prosecution was presented in the form of a security guard at Culver Studios, who said that some time before, Arbuckle had tried to bribe him with cash to give him the key to Virginia Rappe's dressing room. He had refused, but Zay Prevost and other witnesses had, curiously, changed their mind, now denying earlier damning testimonies. They also claimed that the prosecution had forced them to make the earlier statements. Dr. Heinrich was now less certain of his declaration concerning the Arbuckle-Rappe fingerprints on the door. He admitted they could be faked. A maid was called by the defense, who said she had thoroughly cleaned the door of room 1219. It must all have seemed rather curious to the jury, if not suspicious. The prosecution had great difficulty in rounding up its witnesses to testify. There was undoubtedly a fear amongst them that their careers would be damaged by doing so. Several were warned or bribed by Arbuckle's friends. Betty Campbell, who had changed her evidence to state the exact opposite of that she had originally claimed, admitted she had been approached by Hollywood figures to do so, but denied she had been paid $50,000 for this. By the end of the trial, Arbuckle's attorney McNabb was so confident of acquittal, he deigned to reply to the prosecution case. He was mistaken. Perhaps it was as a result of this, or possibly because the jury found the disappearance of prosecution witnesses and the obvious reversals of testimonies too much to swallow, that 15 hours of deliberation again resulted in a hung jury. This time for a 10-2 guilty verdict against Arbuckle. Once again a mistrial was called, and the case presented for trial a third time. The third trial commenced on the 13th of March 1922. The same judge, Louderback, sat on the bench for a final weary time. The defence and prosecution counsels were as before. This trial was different, though. It was a confusion of people who had sworn one thing and now changed their minds, of bad-tempered accusations and counter-accusations by prosecutors and defence counsel. The defence launched an unbridled attack on Virginia Rappe. She drank excessively, it claimed. She had abdominal problems. She was promiscuous. She got drunk at parties and stripped off. It was even hinted that she had an illegitimate child she had abandoned, and numerous miscarriages. Its approach seemed to have evolved into one which relied largely on throwing as much mud as possible at the dead woman, in the sure knowledge that some, perhaps most of it, would stick, and in this they were successful. They attacked Maud Delmont, too, her character and reliability, and the fact that she had not been called by the prosecution to support its case, even though she was its chief instigator. Many of the witnesses had disappeared or recanted their testimony. Betty Campbell could not be found. Zay Prevost, whose evidence was regarded as key, under intense pressure from the prosecutors and from Arbuckle's friends, fled abroad. 3 other witnesses disappeared, including the maid who had heard the woman's screams of "No, no, no," and a man's reply, "Shut up." It looked bleak for the prosecution. The case for the state was leaking like a colander. On April 12, 1922, the jury of 12 men and women acquitted Roscoe Arbuckle after just 6 minutes' deliberation. They also issued an extraordinary public statement apologizing to him, then one by one shook hands with him. The statement began, "Acquittal is not enough for Roscoe Arbuckle." It then commended him for his manly attitude, and ended, "We wish him success and hope the American people will see that Roscoe Arbuckle is entirely innocent and free from all blame." It was claimed the statement was written spontaneously by the jurors, but if it reads like a publicity handout, It is difficult not to suspect that that is precisely what it was. Although the trial eventually produced a result, an acquittal for Arbuckle, the manner of its doing so settled little on the question of whether or not he was responsible for Virginia Rappe's death. There are a great many disquieting aspects to the Virginia Rappe case. The reversed testimonies, the stream of witnesses discovered to be perjuring themselves, and the clear implication that they were in the pay of the defence, Arbuckle, and his friends, is unsettling. In the end, the final trial was a confused mass of conflicting evidence and unseemly abuse traded between counsel. Was Arbuckle guilty, or an unfortunate victim of malign, self-interested people and circumstances, as writers on the subject have claimed ever since? There are insuperable problems to the version of events Arbuckle gave, and they are hardly compatible with the evidence given by a host of witnesses, nor even with a common-sense understanding of the facts or of human behaviour. In the first place, a urologist said that spontaneous bladder rupture was highly unlikely. It had been caused by external pressure. Other doctors concurred, and as a matter of fact, the overwhelming risk factor for ruptured bladder is blunt force trauma to the abdomen, often involving fracture of the pubic bones. Secondly, Arbuckle initially claimed he was never alone with Rappe, but he admitted subsequently that he was, and also that he had locked the door on them both. He tried to claim that he had done so before he realized Rappe was in the room. But even if the circumstances individually are conceivable, the sum of them is not. His version of events is not only improbable, it is unbelievable. Delmont claimed he followed Rappe into the room, or pulled her in. The best that can be said of this is that it is more likely than not. Why? Because of the fact that the two were alone in a locked room. Some circumstance led to this, and Arbuckle's claim of not being aware of her presence is the less likely explanation of the two. But if he did go into his room in the manner he claimed, a room where a woman whom he is known to have been pursuing for 5 years just happened to be alone at that time, did he really lock the door before becoming aware of her presence? It is a stretch, and even if he did so, why did he not call for assistance immediately upon finding her ill? Call her friends, Mrs. Delmont, for instance. Is it possible that while alone in his room with this beautiful woman whom he coveted, he carried her to the bed at her request? Would she not have sought her friends, rather than a man she was afraid of and was said to dislike? And all the while Mrs. Delmont was hammering on the door, demanding that he open it. Others were gathering outside the door, too, presumably amused, if other events at the party are an indicator, and he, oblivious to all, and ostensibly in the room to change his clothes to take a woman to the station, was still in his pyjamas. The woman was lying on his bed, ill. There was a hullabaloo outside his door, and he, absent for at least 30 minutes, was doing what? And when the hotel assistant manager, Boyle, arrived, he opened the door wearing Virginia Rappe's hat. 30 minutes he had been in there alone with Virginia Rappe, and now emerged nonchalantly wearing her hat. And is it possible that the nature of Virginia Rappe's ailment, not previously known or treated by a doctor, manifested itself that day behind the locked door of a room in which she was alone with Arbuckle, and that it caused her to tear off her clothes? It is difficult to believe. And consider this. Roscoe Arbuckle did not, as Sherman claimed, hold a party on Labour Day for old friends to chat. It was a party with sex as its objective. His parties were known for this. A woman gave evidence that she had been warned of the sexual dangers of Arbuckle's parties. Sherman, Fishback, and Arbuckle did not go to San Francisco for a chat. They had a single purpose, and the subsequent behaviour of all three of these men proved this. There were other oddities. Why was he in his pyjamas? He claimed, unconvincingly in my view, that injury had made them more comfortable for him to wear. But principally, It was a sign of his libidinous intentions, as well as being a statement of his power as a star that he wore them. It is hard to accept that a beautiful woman, drunk, was in his room, alone with him, locked in that room with him, apart from her friends or any possibility of rescue, for an innocent reason. Or that she was lying on his bed with her underwear torn off because she had torn it off herself, nor on the bed because he had laid her there, having washed her face for her, and carried her in out of consideration, as he claimed. Would a man of such delicacy and of such gentle consideration towards her only minutes later admit to saying to her, "Shut up, or I'll throw you out of the window"? And yet the jury was asked to believe these two incompatible things. She had not, surely, as a matter of coincidence, while locked in Arbuckle's room alone with him, succumbed to such an unlikely event as her bladder spontaneously rupturing. Many people gave evidence she had been quite well beforehand. Would she have gone to the party had she not been? She had never seen a doctor about this strange malady the defence claimed she possessed, and those witnesses who claimed it were tainted, and several were found to have perjured themselves to establish this, or to be friends or acquaintances of Arbuckle's. Others were known to have tried to sell such false testimony to the defence, who appeared only to have mildly demurred at the offer. Virginia Rappe had seen a doctor only once in 8 years, for a medical condition which had nothing to do with her bladder. Her only illnesses in recent years had been colds. The 3 doctors appointed by the court to examine the organs of Virginia Rappe declared there was nothing amiss with her, nor was there evidence of a pre-existing condition. She was not known to be promiscuous, nor to have venereal disease or another sexual ailment, as Mac Sennett, a close friend of Arbuckle's, claimed. Nor was she pregnant. And set against this, at least 8 people, Maud Delmont, Betty Campbell, Zay Prevost, Alice Blake, Al Semnica, and 3 nurses, all testified to being told by Virginia Rappe that Arbuckle had hurt her. That most of these changed their testimonies by the 2nd and 3rd trials to say quite the reverse subsequently, or disappeared, does not lessen the validity of their early statements. It reinforces it, and leads to the inevitable conclusion that they had, as the prosecutors believed and claimed, been bribed, or otherwise got at, by Arbuckle's friends and attorneys. That both of the men Arbuckle had travelled to the party with in his Pierce Arrow both attempted to employ the exact same strategy, i.e., that of locking a woman in their room against her will for sexual purposes, but were thwarted, is not coincidental. It suggests a behaviour or practice common to all 3 men. As Lowell Sherman said on the stand, Arbuckle was a big star. You don't question such men. Indeed. It is the case that the defence, in its efforts to win an acquittal for Arbuckle, attacked everyone, and even made counter-accusations against the prosecutors of bullying and threatening witnesses to procure false evidence. But even if we can admit of the possibility that 1 or even 2 could have been pressured, it is against the run of common sense to accept that all of these people could be. 8 people individually agreed initially that Virginia Rappe had used words that accused Arbuckle. There were far too many people who gave accounts which accorded with that of Maud Delmont's for it to be possible for them all to have been suborned. It is for this reason that the balance of probability in the case lies with the prosecuting attorney Brady and the state. But when it came to the matter of proof, it was not sufficient. The first jury seemed to acknowledge a likelihood of Arbuckle's guilt in their deliberations. The second thought him guilty. This suggests that the argument lay along a fault line of proof, not of whether Arbuckle was responsible for her death, but whether it could be proved. The third jury's absolute acquittal is incomprehensible because it veers so far from the judgments of the earlier juries, and of the known facts of the case. We have in recent years heard stories of powerful figures in the movie world, acting in plain sight, abuse those in subordinate positions to themselves, and get away with it for a long period. who can hear of the incident concerning Lowell Sherman's locking Betty Campbell in his room, those outside the door laughing, and the frightened woman escaping to the bathroom and thence to safety, without being reminded of the Harvey Weinstein case? Can anyone doubt what Sherman's intentions towards Betty Campbell were, or what Freddie Fishback's intentions were as she fled the bedroom in grabbing her and trying to force her back into the room? And for that matter, can it be doubted that Roscoe Arbuckle, in locking the door on himself and Virginia Rappe, had not the precise same object as his two friends in mind, the only difference being that in this case he succeeded where they did not, with tragic consequences. And as in recent cases in Movieland, one of the most shocking revelations is that those who witness the events, who know of them, are compliant with them. Those outside the door laughing that Lowell Sherman is about to rape Betty Campbell laugh still. It is a human failing that by our supplication some amongst our number can be placed in positions of such power, way beyond their deserts or beyond anything that is sensible. We wish to make gods of those who only live and breathe and die as us, and in so doing we are the means of elevating such people to a point where abuse becomes almost a natural consequence. Henry Kissinger once said that power is the ultimate aphrodisiac. Perhaps, but it also provides the ultimate tool of abuse, the means by which the haves force into supplication the have-nots. Lord Acton's prescriptive here is closer to the mark. All power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Arbuckle was at the top of the tree in 1921. He lived a wild life. He was not the cuddly ingenue of his movies, the lovable country bumpkin of his comedies. We wish our movie stars, our heroes, to be as the characters they portray on screen. Of course they are not. They are actors. They are real people. Roscoe Arbuckle was at once a more world-wise man, a more intelligent man without doubt, and was highly gifted. But he had his failings. He was probably addicted to morphine, a habit he had formed after a serious leg injury in 1916. He was a heavy drinker, certainly, a serial womanizer. His parties were opportunities for sexual encounters for him and his friends. They were always supplied copiously with drink and young women. He was not unique in this. So many other stars, plumped up with fame and the arrogance it nurtures, were notoriously remiss in their sexual conduct. But Arbuckle was the one caught. That might have seemed unfair to some. His colleagues undoubtedly sympathized with him, but it was from the dubious and skewed perspective that everyone else was doing it too. It is the moral panacea of the reprobate. Arbuckle earned big, and he spent big too. He liked to throw parties. "Late hours and lots of parties keep me in the pink," he was quoted as saying, and he was known for his insatiable pursuit of women. If there weren't beautiful women in the world, he told his friend Max Sennett, I wouldn't want to live. He boasted to Adela Rogers St. John's in a photoplay interview in 1920 of his attractiveness to women and predicted that the time of the big man was coming. There was nothing unusual in all of this for a big screen star, but even by Hollywood standards his parties were bywords for excess. Joyce Clark, a cafe singer who was invited to the Labor Day party by Arbuckle, said she had been warned of the sexual aspects of his parties. And Henry Lehrman, the fiancé of the dead woman, said that when he had directed Arbuckle in his movies, he had had to warn him to stay away from the women on set. Arbuckle seemed to be unable to stop himself, and as his friend Lowell Sherman said, he was a big star. You don't question a big star. There was no shortage of beautiful young women willing to trade their charms for the favour of a powerful man at St. Francis Hotel on that Labour Day in 1921. But Roscoe Arbuckle had a different objective that day, another lust to satisfy. The beautiful Virginia Rappe was one woman who had not succumbed to his charms. He had pursued her for 5 years, all the time he had known her, but without success. Perhaps Virginia was not a woman who guarded her virtue jealously, but she was simply not interested in him. There is nothing a man who always gets what he wants prizes so highly as that which he cannot have. He denied himself nothing, yet he was being denied. It was an itch he could not scratch. He had made numerous efforts, and even once tried to get hold of the key to her room so that he could, he claimed, play a prank on her. The security guard refused the star, to his credit. It is easy to imagine the kind of prank such a man as Roscoe Arbuckle might play. The same kind of prank Lowell Sherman tried to play on Betty Campbell, and Freddie Fishback was also willing to try the humour of. Of course, for Betty Campbell, as for Virginia Rappe, the joke was a little one-sided. The doorman sensed it. He knew picture people. He doubtless knew Arbuckle and his reputation, and so did Virginia Rappe. She had said to Lehrman that he was vulgar and disrespectful of women. She felt uncomfortable with the man. Virginia had a few drinks, was probably quite drunk, and Arbuckle got her into his bedroom, perhaps on the pretext of discussing her career away from the party, perhaps just by pulling her in, as the prosecution claimed, and Delmont had described earlier. Arbuckle closed the door and turned the key in the lock. Virginia Rappe had no means of escape. She almost certainly tried. The handprints suggest this, no matter that the defence did all it could to dismiss these, to claim they had been faked because a maid had cleaned the room thoroughly before it had been dusted for prints. Did she really wipe all the upper surface of the doors over? What a diligent maid! Virginia Rappe was trapped in his room. There is no innocent construction that can be placed on this, or if there is one, then it escapes me. With all this in mind, there are two critical questions to consider in the Arbuckle case. The first is, did something happen of a sexual nature behind that locked door between Virginia Rappe and Arbuckle? The second is, if it did, and only if it did, was it a consensual act or not? Taking question one, it seems beyond any possible doubt that something sexual occurred between them. Everything points decidedly to this. Both of the first two juries argued the toss on this point. The second question is more difficult. Was it consensual? The matter of whether she was ill or not now falls away with question two, legally and morally, because if it was not consensual, then it was murder, whether she had a medical condition or not. In the past 40 years or so, the nature of consent has changed. The criteria applied that constitute an act of rape are quite different to those which defined it 100 years ago. Social and cultural factors have influenced it, as have changes in public attitudes. But even with this taken into consideration, it seems to me that it was probably not a consensual act. There are a number of things which suggest this. 1. The fact that she was injured. It is a great deal more likely, for obvious reasons, that such a big and heavy man would injure a woman during sex which was not a consensual act, or was resisted, than would be the case where there was consent. 2. The configuration of the handprints on the door suggests she had tried to escape. 3. Virginia Rappe, even if drunk, and though in great pain, was anxious that Henry Lehrman, her fiancé, should not learn of the matter. Why? Because it is an unfortunate fact that a victim is often blamed for the crime of their assailant in such a case. It certainly suggests that she was not willing. 4. Her words to 8 people that Roscoe had done this were accusatory. They suggest again that he did not have her consent. 5. The bruising on her arms and legs suggest a degree of violence or a degree of roughness that make a consensual act improbable. 6. Arbuckle's conduct afterwards, "Shut up or I'll throw you out of the window," are a continuation of aggression and do not accord with his claims of care and consideration for her. 7. And the testimony of Betty Campbell that he was grinning afterwards, of Maud Delmont that he was wearing Virginia's hat at a rakish angle, these are the attributes of the conqueror, of one who has triumphed. Her hat is his trophy. All of these things imply an absence of consent, but no more than this. None of this is the kind of proof that a court of law quite rightly requires in such a case, but it amply supplies us, in my view, with the truth of the matter, and the truth is important. What Maud Delmont said, "I have wanted you for 5 years," sounds in every respect to fit the circumstances of that encounter in room 1219. And consider this, Maud Delmont was not in a position to know that Arbuckle had known Rappe for 5 years. Few did know it, but Arbuckle knew it, and he said it. It bears out her testimony. That was heard by Prevost. He had wanted her for 5 years. He had pursued her for 5 years. He had been separated for 4 years himself. She was recently parted from Lehrman. He was alone with her in a locked room now. There were no others present. Maud Delmont was a terrible witness to have to rely on, but because she was a bigamist, it does not follow that where her words ring with the authority of truth, they should be dismissed. She had a bad character, but there weren't many parish priests or League of Decency women present at the party in Fatty Arbuckle's suite that day. Matthew Brady had only such witnesses because they were the only ones present at the party. Maud Delmont did knock on the door of 1219. She called out and tried the door as she said she did, and finding it locked and hearing Virginia scream, she began to kick the door furiously. Her act was entirely consistent with every aspect of what we know of the situation in the suite and in room 1219 that day. The tales that Virginia had had numerous abortions were simply untrue, and it was part of a policy to discredit, even to revile the dead woman. Nor was she pregnant. The 3 doctors employed by the court to disentangle the various testimonies of state and defence doctors, who each came with a different opinion, were clear on this. Nor was there any other abnormality, sexual disease, or anything else to suggest she was not a normal young woman. It is too often the last refuge of a hopeless defence to accuse the victim. And her promiscuity, if it was true, it was not, was irrelevant. We know she did not wish to have sex with Roscoe Arbuckle, and it is enough. Claims relating to bladder infections are also of no relevance. Cystitis does not cause a bladder to rupture, and there was no evidence she had suffered from this. Her injuries were caused by great pressure being imposed on the abdomen. We should also, I think, acknowledge that Virginia Rappe's death was never Arbuckle's intention. Her death must have shocked him profoundly. It was also a sad end to a talented man's career, a man who did so much for the development of the picture industry as an art form in the 20th century, and gave so much laughter and pleasure to millions of ordinary people, was ruined and lost to us. After the trial, there were parties thrown for Fatty Arbuckle in Hollywood, at which alcohol was conspicuously absent. He was feted. He was fined $500 for breaching prohibition laws after the trial. He had a meeting with Paramount 2 weeks after his acquittal. It was decided that he should take a break to let things die down and to allow the public memory to fade, and so he undertook a world trip. But the public memory did not fade. He was no longer the winsome, chubby, nice guy, the lovable simpleton, nor could he ever be again. He continued as a director, writer in films, using the name William Goodrich, was to a degree rehabilitated to the public. But the stains of accusation, the exposure of his character, his rapacious, predatory, sexual nature, was hard to reconcile with the humorous, shy, lovable bumpkin he had created so memorably for the screen. He was divorced from Minter Durfee in 1925 and married Doris Dean that same year. They divorced 3 years later, and he married a final time to Addie MacPhail in June 1932. A year later, on the 29th of June 1933, after negotiating a contract with Warner Brothers and a return to the big screen, he died of a heart attack in his sleep. He was 46 years old. Virginia Rappe, whose life was cut short on the 9th of September 1921 at the age of 30, was buried at the Hollywood Forever Cemetery in a dress provided by Charlie Chaplin's wife, Mildred, on the 19th of September 1921. Henry Lehrman paid $1,000 for flowers to cover her casket. The funeral was well attended. Oliver Hardy was a pallbearer. Lehrman remained embittered towards Arbuckle all his life, and apparently threatened to kill him. It was hardly surprising. He died in 1946 and was laid to rest in the same Hollywood Forever cemetery, in a grave alongside that of the woman who had once been his fiancée, Virginia Rappe.